The sound came first, a sharp, hollow crack, plastic against bone. It echoed down the narrow jet bridge like a gunshot, stopping every movement cold. For half a second, nobody understood what they had just heard. Then a woman gasped. A carry-on suitcase tipped over. Somewhere behind the first-class curtain, a man whispered, "Jesus Christ." The passenger who'd been struck didn't fall. She swayed, caught herself on the edge of a leather seat, and slowly lifted her head. Her cheek was already flushing deep red. Her breathing stayed even, controlled, almost deliberate. Standing over her was a man in a tailored grey jacket with a gold lapel pin. His hand was still raised, fingers trembling, as if his body hadn't yet caught up with what his temper had just done. "You don't get to ignore me," he said. His voice was loud. Too loud. The kind of loud that dared the room to challenge him. This was seat 2D of the first-class cabin on a morning flight leaving Boston for San Francisco. The plane wasn't even fully boarded yet. The engines were silent. The air felt thin, brittle, like glass about to shatter. The woman he'd struck was named Claire Monroe. Most people around her would have guessed she was in her early 40s. Dark coat, simple shoes, hair pulled back tight, not for style but for efficiency. No jewelry, except a thin silver band on her left hand. She looked like someone who had places to be and no interest in being seen. The man was named Douglas Hale, 62. Broad shoulders softened by comfort, not age. He carried himself like a courtroom he'd already won. His boarding pass dangled from his fingers. First class, window seat, 3A. Though he was standing 2 rows back, blocking the aisle, refusing to move. "You took my seat," Douglas said again, louder now, turning slightly so more people could hear him. "I don't know who you think you are, but I don't sit behind people like you." The words landed heavy. A few heads snapped up. Others looked away, eyes fixed on tray tables and seat numbers, like they could disappear into them. Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back either. She stayed exactly where she was, one hand resting on the seat in front of her, fingers curled into the leather. "This is my assigned seat," she said calmly. 2D. You're in 3A. You're blocking boarding." Douglas laughed, a short, humorless bark. "I fly this route every week. That seat has always been mine. They know me here." He jabbed his finger toward the galley. "Ask them." A flight attendant hurried down the aisle. Her name tag read, Lisa Carter. Mid-50s. Tired eyes, professional smile stretched thin. "Sir, please," Lisa said. "We need to clear the aisle." Douglas turned on her instantly. "Then move her." Lisa blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me," he snapped. "I paid good money for this ticket. I'm not spending 6 hours crammed behind someone who doesn't belong up here." Claire felt it then. Not fear, not anger. Something colder. The familiar pressure behind the ribs. The recognition. This wasn't about a seat. It never was. Around them, first-class passengers shifted. A man in a navy blazer leaned toward his wife and murmured something she shook her head at. A younger woman near the window had already pulled out her phone, thumb hovering, undecided. Lisa cleared her throat. "Sir, everyone here has a first-class ticket." Douglas leaned in closer to Claire, lowering his voice just enough to make it intimate. "Dangerous. You can save yourself a lot of trouble by moving. I'm trying to be polite." Claire met his eyes for the first time. Really met them. Pale blue, sharp. Used to winning, used to people folding. "I'm not moving," she said. The air seemed to pull tight around them. Douglas's jaw clenched. His breath came faster. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, then back at her, as if calculating how much force the room would tolerate. "You think this is a standoff?" he said. "I can make one call and have you escorted off this plane." Behind him, Lisa shifted her weight, hands clasped together. She'd seen men like this before. Men who spoke in ultimatums. Men who mistook volume for authority. "Sir," she said carefully, "if there's a problem, we can step aside and—" "No," Douglas cut her off. "I'm done stepping aside." He reached out then. Not to strike, to grab Claire's arm, just above the elbow, fingers digging in with a familiarity that assumed ownership. That was the second sound, the sharp intake of breath from the surrounding passengers. Claire didn't pull away. She looked down at his hand on her sleeve, then back up at his face. "Take your hand off me," she said. Quiet. Flat. For a moment, Douglas hesitated. Something flickered across his expression. Doubt, maybe. Or the instinctive awareness that lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Then pride won. He squeezed. "Problem?" he said loudly, turning toward the cabin like he was addressing a jury. Claire felt the pressure, felt the eyes, felt the old reflex rise up, the one that said, endure, de-escalate, survive. She pushed it down. This was not a moment for shrinking. She twisted her arm just enough to break his grip and stepped back half a pace. The movement was small, but it changed the geometry of the space. Now Douglas was exposed. Center aisle. Everyone looking. Lisa inhaled sharply. "Sir, that's enough." Douglas spun on her. "Stay out of this." The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom, announcing a boarding delay due to a minor issue in the forward cabin. Minor. The word hung there, absurd. Claire felt the eyes of the cabin on her now, measuring, judging. Some sympathetic, some impatient, some already assigning blame. She knew how this story usually ended. She'd seen it play out in conference rooms, court lobbies, hospital hallways, the louder voice framed as the reasonable one, the composed woman painted as the problem. But this time, something was different. Douglas didn't know it yet. None of them did. But the moment his hand touched her arm, the story had already shifted tracks. Claire reached into her coat pocket slowly, not defensively, deliberately. She felt Douglas tense, saw his shoulders lift, ready to perform outrage. She pulled out her phone. The screen lit up. She tapped once. A small red dot appeared at the top. Recording. "I want it on record," she said, voice steady, carrying farther than she expected. You struck me, you grabbed me, and you are now preventing this flight from boarding." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Douglas scoffed, but there was a crack in it now. "You think that scares me?" Claire looked past him, at Lisa, at the watching passengers, at the thin curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. "No," she said. "I think you're scared already." Douglas opened his mouth to respond, to threaten, to reclaim the upper hand. He never got the chance. From the cockpit doorway, footsteps approached, heavy, purposeful, and with them, the unmistakable sound of authority entering the room. The story had only just begun. Captain Raymond Holt filled the aisle without raising his voice. Late 50s, steel-grey hair, shoulders squared by decades of command. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The room bent toward him on instinct alone. "What's going on?" he said. Not a question. A demand for truth. Douglas Hale turned immediately, relief flashing across his face like a match struck in the dark. "Captain, thank God. This passenger is being disruptive, refusing crew instructions, recording people without consent." Claire watched the lie form and settle, smooth and practiced. She saw how easily it slid off his tongue, how natural it felt to him. Years of boardrooms had trained him well. Captain Holt didn't answer right away. His eyes moved, took in the raised voices frozen mid-breath. The phone still glowing in Claire's hand. The red mark on her cheek already deepening. Lisa's clenched fingers. The way Douglas stood half a step too close to her, claiming space that wasn't his. "Ma'am," Holt said to Claire, "are you injured?" She didn't exaggerate, didn't minimize. "I was struck and grabbed. Boarding was blocked." Douglas barked a laugh. "This is ridiculous. I barely touched her." Holt turned his head slowly. The movement alone quieted the cabin. "Sir, step back into the aisle and lower your voice." Douglas stiffened. He hadn't expected that. "Captain, with respect, I'm a frequent flyer. I've logged more miles on this airline than—" "I don't care," Holt said calmly. "Right now, you're obstructing my flight." That word landed hard. "My." Douglas hesitated. Pride wrestled with calculation. Around them, the phones were no longer hovering. They were up, recording, unapologetic. He stepped back one pace. Not because he was told to, but because the room had shifted against him. Holt nodded once, then looked to Lisa. "What happened?" Lisa swallowed. Sir refused to take his assigned seat. Became verbally aggressive, then physical. Douglas snapped his head toward her. "You're exaggerating." Holt raised a hand. Douglas stopped mid-sentence. The silence was sudden and complete. "Sir," Holt said, voice low, "if you interrupt me again, this conversation ends differently." Douglas's face flushed. The muscles along his jaw worked as he clamped his mouth shut. Holt turned back to Claire. "Are you willing to continue this flight?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She felt her pulse in her ears, steady but strong. She was aware of everything now. The smell of coffee from the galley, the low hum of air circulation, the weight of being watched. "Yes," she said. "I am." Douglas scoffed. "Unbelievable." Holt's eyes snapped back to him. "Sir, you have two options. Take your assigned seat and remain silent, or exit the aircraft." "You can't be serious," Douglas said. "I have meetings, people waiting." "So does everyone else," Holt replied. "Sit down." Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. He glanced around the cabin, measuring, counting allies, finding none. "Fine," he muttered, and shoved past Claire toward row 3. His shoulder clipped the seat on purpose. A petty, childish thing. Claire didn't react. She didn't need to. Boarding resumed, but the air never recovered. People moved more quietly now, as if the cabin had learned it was capable of violence. Claire sat down, buckled in. Her hands rested on her lap. They didn't shake. Lisa leaned in close. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Claire met her eyes. "I know." Douglas sat rigidly in 3A, staring straight ahead. His knee bounced. He pulled out his phone, typed furiously, stopped, deleted, typed again. Each movement sharper than the last. The plane pushed back from the gate. The engines spooled up. A deep vibration rolled through the cabin, settling into bones. Claire closed her eyes for a moment as the aircraft lifted. Not in relief, in focus. She opened her phone again once the seatbelt sign chimed off. The recording had captured everything. The strike, the grab, the threats. His voice, clear and unmistakable. Douglas noticed. He leaned across the aisle, voice low and venomous. "You think you won something?" Claire didn't look at him. "I think you should stop talking." He laughed softly. "You don't know who I am." That almost made her smile. He leaned closer. "I can ruin people quietly. You made this public." Claire turned then, just enough to meet his eyes. "You made it public when you touched me." For the first time, uncertainty crept in. Small, almost invisible. But there. He leaned back, lips pressed thin. The flight settled into its rhythm. Drink service, trays, polite murmurs, a performance of normalcy stretched thin over raw nerves. Claire opened her laptop. The privacy filter rendered her screen black to anyone else. She logged in. Secure network. Encrypted access. Douglas watched anyway. He couldn't help himself. "What do you do?" he asked after a long silence, false casualness in his tone. "Legal, HR, some kind of compliance watchdog." Claire kept typing. "You should rest." He snorted. "That's not an answer." She stopped, looked at him fully now. The lights caught the planes of his face, the fine lines that spoke of comfort and control. Men like him always assumed proximity equaled knowledge. "I work in oversight," she said. Douglas's smile widened. "Figures. What does that mean?" "It means people like you love rules," he said. "People like me make things happen." Claire considered him. The man. The fear under the bravado. The way his eyes flicked every time someone glanced his way. "People like you," she said quietly. "Break things and call it leadership." His smile faded. He shifted, lowering his voice further. You don't want this to follow you. The internet eats women alive. Claire nodded slowly. So do men like you? He stared at her. The words had landed somewhere tender. You think I haven't dealt with this before? He said. A complaint here, a settlement there. It blows over. Claire closed her laptop. This won't. He laughed, louder now, too loud. A few heads turned. You're not that important. The plane jolted lightly through turbulence. The cabin lights flickered. Claire's voice didn't. You struck a federally protected passenger mid-boarding. On camera, you interfered with flight operations. His face drained of a shade of color. Just one. That's not how it works, he said. But the certainty was gone. She tilted her head slightly. Isn't it? Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Somewhere behind the curtain, a baby cried. A spoon clinked against china. Life went on. Douglas leaned back, eyes forward now, jaw tight. His hands were clenched into fists on his thighs. Claire reopened her laptop. Typed. Sent. Across the cabin, Lisa glanced at her, then quickly away. Captain Holt emerged briefly from the cockpit, eyes scanning. He paused when he reached row 2, met Claire's gaze, gave a subtle nod. Nothing more. The plane climbed steadily westward, cutting through cloud and consequence alike. Douglas Hale thought the worst was over. He was wrong. He had mistaken silence for mercy. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed to a low amber glow, and the plane slipped into that suspended state where time felt artificial, stitched together by turbulence and recycled air. Most passengers settled into screens and sleep, but Douglas Hale stayed rigid in his seat, eyes open, jaw tight, mind grinding. He kept replaying the moment Captain Holt had shut him down. The way the room had turned, the way the power he was used to wielding had evaporated without ceremony. It didn't sit right. It never did when the world refused to bend. Across the aisle, Claire Monroe hadn't slept. She worked with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, fingers moving, pausing, moving again. The glow of her screen reflected faintly in the window beside her, a ghost image Douglas tried and failed to decipher. He leaned closer, voice pitched low. You send your little email yet? Claire didn't look up. Several. That stung. He swallowed, then forced a chuckle. You think someone's coming for me at 37,000 feet? She paused, just long enough to be deliberate. I think accountability doesn't need altitude. Douglas scoffed, but the sound was hollow. He turned away, stared at the seatback screen without seeing it. 2 rows up, a man in a brown blazer shifted uncomfortably. His name was Harold Finch, late 60s, retired federal prosecutor. He'd been watching everything since the jet bridge, eyes sharp despite the age spots on his hands. He leaned toward the woman beside him, whispering, That wasn't a slap. That was an assault. The woman nodded slowly. I saw. In the galley, Lisa poured coffee with hands that still hadn't quite steadied. She caught her reflection in the metal paneling and barely recognized herself. 27 years flying. She'd thought she'd seen every kind of entitlement. She hadn't seen this kind of quiet resolve before. Claire closed her laptop and stood, smoothing her coat. Douglas stiffened instantly, tracking her movement like prey. "Bathroom's that way," he muttered, gesturing forward. "I know," she said, already stepping past him. As she moved toward the rear lavatory, she felt the eyes on her again. The measuring, the wondering, the unspoken question of whether she'd been right to stand her ground. She locked the door behind her and rested her hands briefly on the sink. Looked at herself. The mark on her cheek had faded to a dull shadow, but she could still feel it, a phantom pressure. She breathed in, out. Controlled. Always controlled. When she stepped back into the aisle, Douglas was waiting. "You don't get to walk away from me," he said under his breath. Claire stopped. Slowly. The aisle was narrow. The moment intimate in the worst way. "You're making this worse," he continued. "For yourself, for everyone." She met his gaze. "You should return to your seat." "You don't tell me what to do." A voice cut in from behind them. Calm, unyielding. Actually, she can. Captain Holt stood there again, hands clasped behind his back. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Douglas froze. "Captain." "I was just—" "Sir," Holt said. "Sit down. Now." Something in his tone made even Douglas understand there would be no third warning. He backed away, stumbled slightly as he returned to his seat. Claire moved past the captain. Holt caught her eye. "Everything all right?" "For now," she said. Holt nodded. "Let me know if that changes." She returned to her seat. Buckled in. The plane hummed on. Douglas stared at the back of her head, a pressure building behind his eyes. He pulled out his phone again, fingers slick with sweat. Typed a message, deleted it. Typed another. This time, he sent it. Across the country, in a glass office overlooking the Potomac, a phone lit up on a conference table. The message was brief, urgent, defensive. A man named Victor Langley read it without expression. Early 50s, grey at the temples. General Counsel. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He already knew who Claire Monroe was. Knew exactly why Douglas Hale was in trouble. Back on the plane, Douglas exhaled sharply, trying to convince himself he'd regained control. He hadn't been escorted off. He hadn't been restrained. He was still flying. That had to count for something. He leaned toward Claire again, softer now. "Look, we can reset this. Adults. Professionals." She didn't turn. "Sit down. I'm trying to help you." She looked at him then. Really looked. "You're trying to save yourself." The honesty cut. He flinched before he could stop himself. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he said. "People like me don't fall alone." Her voice stayed even. "People like you don't fall because no one pushes." The cabin shook lightly as they hit another pocket of turbulence. A few gasps. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Douglas leaned back, heart pounding. For the first time since boarding, fear took root, not panic. Fear's quieter cousin, The one that whispers instead of screams. A flight attendant passed, offering water. Douglas waved her away. His mouth was dry anyway. Claire pulled out her phone again. This time she didn't hide it. She tapped, scrolled, paused. Harold Finch watched from 2 rows up. He recognized that look, the look of someone timing their move. The hours dragged. Night deepened outside the windows. The plane became a capsule of tension hurtling westward. Douglas tried to sleep. Couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment his hand had connected. Felt the room turn on him again. He whispered, barely audible, "You're enjoying this." Claire answered without looking at him. "No." "Then why?" "Because it matters." He laughed softly. To who? She finally turned fully toward him. "Everyone who's been told to move so you can be comfortable." The words landed heavy. Douglas looked away. Near the end of the flight, the intercom chimed. Captain Holt's voice filled the cabin, steady and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are fastened." Douglas's pulse spiked. Descent meant arrival. Arrival meant consequences. Claire powered down her laptop and placed it carefully in her bag. She sat straighter now, poised, ready. Douglas leaned toward her one last time, desperation seeping through. "If you do this, there's no undoing it." She met his eyes. "That's the point." The plane angled downward, city lights blooming below like a field of stars. Somewhere in that grid, people were waiting. Doors were opening. Files were being printed. Douglas Hale had spent his life believing gravity worked for other people. As the wheels prepared to meet the runway, he finally understood it worked for everyone. The wheels hit the runway hard, a solid jolt that rippled through the cabin and snapped every remaining illusion apart. The plane roared, decelerated, then rolled into a long, grinding taxi. Around them, passengers exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for hours without realizing it. Douglas Hale's hands were slick against the armrests. He kept his eyes forward, jaw locked, pretending this was any other arrival, any other city, any other day. But his leg bounced uncontrollably now. The confident stillness he'd worn like armor all his life had cracked, and something frantic was bleeding through. Claire Monroe remained motionless. Seat upright, bag closed, phone resting face down on her lap. She looked composed in a way that felt final, like a judge after the verdict had already been written. The seatbelt sign stayed on. Captain Holt's voice came over the intercom again, slower this time, measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated after we arrive at the gate. Local authorities will be boarding the aircraft." A murmur rolled through the cabin. Heads turned. Phones came back out. Douglas's head snapped toward Claire. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. The plane turned sharply, engines whining down, then came to a stop with a final shudder. The gate locked in. The cabin door remained closed. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of systems still running. Douglas swallowed. His mouth tasted like metal. "You did this," he whispered. It wasn't accusation anymore. It was realization. Claire looked at him then. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "You did." The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Then footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the cabin, followed by a man in a dark suit with a federal badge clipped to his belt. He scanned the rows once, eyes landing immediately on Douglas. "Douglas Hale," the agent said. "Not a question." Douglas stood abruptly. "This is insane. I want a lawyer." The agent didn't flinch. "You'll have that opportunity." Passengers leaned into the aisle to see. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another voice murmured, "About time." Claire stood slowly, not rushed, not hesitant. The movement drew the agent's attention. "Miss Monroe," he said, nodding respectfully. Douglas froze. The sound of her name, spoken with certainty, landed like a blow. "You know her," Douglas said. His voice cracked. "You know her." The agent turned to him. "Yes." "What is this?" Douglas demanded. "Who is she?" Claire stepped forward just enough to stand beside the agent. Not behind him. Beside. "My name is Claire Monroe," she said. "I am the Deputy Director of Federal Transportation Oversight." The cabin went utterly still. Douglas stared at her, the words taking too long to arrange themselves into meaning. "That's not possible." She held his gaze. "It is." His knees seemed to weaken. He grabbed the seat back behind him to stay upright. The agent continued, "You are being detained on suspicion of assault, interference with flight operations, and obstruction of a federally protected employee." "I didn't know," Douglas said hoarsely. "If I had known." "That you were hitting a federal official," Claire said calmly, "or that you were hitting a woman." His mouth opened, closed. Nothing came out. The officers moved in, hands firm but professional. Cold metal clicked around his wrists. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Someone in the cabin began to clap. Tentative at first, then another, then a wave rolled forward, applause swelling, sharp and unapologetic. Douglas flinched at the sound like it was physical pain. His shoulders sagged. The man who had boarded the plane, radiating certainty, now looked shrunken, folded inward by exposure. As they guided him down the aisle, people didn't look away. They stared, some with satisfaction, some with quiet gravity, some with tears in their eyes. Harold Finch stood as Douglas passed. Their eyes met. Harold's expression was not cruel. It was final. Outside the aircraft, cameras flashed. Reporters pressed forward, voices colliding into noise. "Mr. Hale, is it true you assaulted a passenger? Did you interfere with flight operations? Were you aware she was a federal official?" Douglas said nothing. He couldn't. His world had narrowed to the grip on his arms and the glare of light. Claire exited moments later. She didn't pause for cameras, didn't look toward Douglas. She walked straight through the chaos, coat on, chin level, steps steady. A black SUV waited at the curb. The driver opened the door without a word. Inside the car, the noise fell away. The city slid past the windows, bright and indifferent. Claire leaned back, finally allowing herself to breathe all the way out. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. A single message from Victor Langley. Handled. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. There was still work to do. Reports to file. Hearings to prepare for. Policies to enforce. The system didn't fix itself. Behind them, at the terminal, Douglas Hale was being read his rights, each word another weight pressing down on a life built on exemption. That night, news alerts would light up across the country. Video clips would spread, opinions would clash, names would trend. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was that one man had learned, too late, that power was not what he thought it was. And one woman had refused to move. Morning came without softness. Douglas Hale woke to fluorescent light and the smell of disinfectant. The holding room had no windows, only a metal bench bolted to the wall and a camera dome in the corner that never blinked. His wrists ached where the cuffs had been. His throat felt raw, as if he'd spent the night arguing with no one. He sat up slowly, suit wrinkled, collar askew, the gold lapel pin missing. The small symbols that once made people listen were gone, stripped with methodical indifference. A paper cup of water waited on the floor beside the bench. He drank it in one swallow, and immediately wanted more. The door opened with a mechanical click. A woman in a dark blazer stepped in, tablet tucked under her arm. Early 40s. Calm eyes. No smile. "Mr. Hale," she said. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Nolan." Douglas stood too fast. "I want my lawyer." "You'll have access," Nolan replied evenly. "This is an intake interview. You're not required to answer questions." "I'm required to inform you of the charges." She listed them without drama. "Assault, interference with flight crew, obstruction." Each word landed like a separate sentence in a different language, one Douglas had never needed to learn. "This is a misunderstanding," he said hoarsely. "I didn't know who she was." Nolan looked at him. "Identity doesn't determine consent." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The logic was airtight. He'd used it himself countless times, just never against himself. Across the city, Claire Monroe stood in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the bay. The fog hadn't lifted yet. The water below was steel grey, restless. Around the table sat a dozen faces. Aviation safety. Legal. Oversight. People who lived in margins and procedures and the quiet power of enforcement. Claire listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was precise, measured. The room adjusted to her cadence. "The incident is not isolated," she said. "It's a pattern. Escalation enabled by deference. This case gives us leverage." A man with silver hair leaned forward. "Public appetite is high, but we need substance." "You'll have it," Claire said. "Body cam, cabin footage, passenger recordings, crew testimony, timeline analysis." Another voice cut in. "What about optics?" Claire didn't hesitate. Optics don't matter if we're right. Silence followed. Then nods. The meeting adjourned. People filed out, murmuring, phones already lighting up with next steps. Claire remained behind for a moment, hands resting on the back of her chair, watching the fog thin. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lisa Carter. "Thank you for yesterday, for not letting it disappear." Claire typed back. "You did your job. That matters." She slipped the phone into her pocket and headed down the hall. There would be interviews, statements, paperwork that would stretch for months. The work was never clean, only necessary. At the detention center, Douglas sat with his lawyer for the first time. The man was younger than he expected. Sharp suit, faster eyes. "You're in real trouble," the lawyer said without preamble. "The video is bad." "I can explain," Douglas insisted. "I was provoked." The lawyer's expression didn't change. "That defense works when power runs one way. This ran both ways. And the footage shows your hand. Twice." Douglas leaned back, rubbing his face. "I've built companies. I've donated. I know senators." "None of that appears on the charging document," the lawyer replied. "What appears is intent." Douglas stared at the wall. For the first time, the room felt small. By afternoon, the story had metastasized. Headlines sharpened. Pundits picked sides. Some framed it as cancel culture. Others as accountability long overdue. The video looped endlessly, stripped of context, recontextualized again and again. Claire didn't watch it. She didn't need to. She sat with investigators, walking through the incident frame by frame, answering questions that were both clinical and invasive. She spoke plainly. No embellishment, no retreat. "Did you feel threatened?" "Yes." "Did you consider de-escalation?" "I attempted it." "Why didn't you move?" "Because moving would have validated the behavior." The lead investigator paused. "That's not a legal answer." Claire met his eyes. "It's an honest one." He nodded, then continued. That evening, as the sun finally burned through the fog, Claire stood on her balcony and let the wind cut across her face. The city below hummed, indifferent and alive. Somewhere in it, Douglas Hale was learning what it felt like to be processed instead of accommodated. Her phone rang. Victor Langley again. "The board wants a briefing," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be there." They're nervous. They should be. A beat. "You okay?" Claire looked out at the water. "I will be." Across town, Douglas lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The cell was temporary. Clean enough. The mattress thin. Every sound echoed. Every cough, every footstep amplified by the architecture of confinement. He thought about the first time he'd been told to sit down and had complied without a fight. He couldn't remember one. His phone was gone. His watch. The world had narrowed to schedules he didn't control. A guard passed, looked in, moved on. Douglas closed his eyes. The image returned uninvited. Claire's face when she'd said her name. Not triumphant, not cruel. just factual. That was the part that hurt most. He had always believed consequences were negotiable. The next morning, Claire stood at the podium in a federal building, cameras clicking softly. She didn't read from notes. She didn't raise her voice. "This case is not about status," she said. "It's about conduct. Transportation safety depends on compliance, not deference. No passenger is above that." Questions flew. She answered some, declined others. When it was over, she stepped away from the lights and into the quiet corridor beyond. Her reflection passed in the glass. She barely recognized the woman there. Not because she had changed, but because the world had finally aligned with what she'd always known. Later, alone in her office, Claire allowed herself a single, long breath. The day wasn't victory. It was process. The slow grind of accountability turning forward. She opened a file marked Review Pending and began again. Because power, when it meant anything at all, was the refusal to look away. The first crack didn't come from the courtroom. It came from the boardroom. Douglas Hale's company released a statement before noon, carefully worded, bloodless, full of phrases like temporary leave and internal review. By mid-afternoon, the stock dipped. By evening, it slid. The market had a way of smelling fear long before facts arrived. Claire Monroe watched none of it live. She sat in a narrow conference room with no windows, listening to a junior analyst walk through a timeline projected onto the wall. Dates, emails, call logs. A lattice of behavior finally visible when pulled tight. "Notice the gap here," the analyst said, pointing. 3 similar incidents on domestic flights in the past 5 years. Settled quietly. Claire leaned forward. Names. The analyst hesitated. Non-disclosure agreements. "Break them," Claire said. "We have authority." The room shifted. Pens paused. Someone cleared their throat. Outside, the press had begun circling a different question. Not what happened, but why now? Why this man? Why this flight? Why this woman? Claire knew the answer. Timing was a function of courage. That night, she drove home later than usual. The streets were wet from an early rain, reflections stretching and breaking beneath the tires. At a stoplight, a man recognized her, hesitated, then nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. She nodded back, equally small. The light changed. Life moved on. At home, she left her phone by the door, made tea, stood by the counter until the kettle clicked off. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured. It surprised her. She hadn't felt shaken in days. The adrenaline had carried her through. Now, in the quiet, it ebbed. She sat at the table, cup warming her palms, and allowed the memory to surface fully for the first time. The sound of the slap, the weight of eyes, the precise moment when she decided not to yield. It hadn't felt brave. It had felt inevitable. Across the city, Douglas Hale met with his lawyer again. This time, the conversation was shorter, blunter. "The Department of Transportation is expanding the inquiry," the lawyer said. "They're coordinating with justice." Douglas stared at the table. The grain in the wood felt obscene in its detail. "Can we fight it?" "We can," the lawyer said. "But the question is whether you survive the fight." Douglas laughed weakly. "I've survived worse." The lawyer didn't respond. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Douglas poured a drink with shaking hands. The place felt unfamiliar, too big, too quiet. The walls were lined with awards, framed covers, photos with people whose numbers no longer answered. He turned on the television. There she was again, Claire, calm, unmoved. The anchor spoke about oversight and reform. Douglas muted it. He picked up his phone and scrolled, unable to stop himself. Comments blurred together. Some defended him, more didn't. A narrative was forming, and it didn't include redemption. He thought about calling someone. Anyone. The list felt shorter than it ever had. The next morning, Claire sat across from Victor Langley in a smaller office, the kind reserved for decisions that couldn't afford spectators. "They're pushing back," Victor said. "Industry groups, lobbyists. Quietly, for now." "Good," Claire replied. "That means it matters. They'll come for you personally." Claire met his gaze. "They already have." Victor sighed. "You didn't have to be the face of this." "Yes," she said. "I did." He nodded slowly. "Then we protect you." "Protect the work," Claire corrected. "I can take care of myself." By afternoon, the first formal complaint landed. A civil suit. Not from Douglas, from his company, alleging overreach, abuse of authority, political motivation. Claire read it without expression. The language was familiar, the tactic older than any of them. She handed it back to Victor. "They're scared, enough to get ugly. Then let them." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Congressional oversight, cameras, statements prepared in advance. Claire spent hours with her team, refining language that balanced clarity with restraint. Every word mattered now, every pause. The night before the hearing, she dreamed of turbulence. Not the violent kind, the kind that rattled just enough to keep you awake. Douglas didn't sleep at all. He paced his apartment, the drink untouched now, the television flickering on and off. At dawn, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. They looked different to him, capable of things he'd never been forced to reckon with. The hearing room was cold, designed to be. The kind of cold that sharpened attention. Claire sat at the witness table, posture straight, hands folded. The room filled slowly. Lawmakers, aides, press. Faces arranged in practiced neutrality. Douglas sat behind his legal team, 2 rows back. He kept his eyes on the back of her head. It was strange, seeing her from this angle. Smaller, unassuming, and yet the center of gravity in the room bent toward her. The gavel struck. Questions came fast. Some hostile, some curious, some performative. Claire answered each with the same cadence. Steady, factual, unmoved by bait. "Did you leverage your position to best escalate this incident?" "No." "Did you consider recusing yourself?" "No." Why not? Because recusal would have implied conflict. There was none. A murmur rippled. One congressman leaned forward. "You expect us to believe this wasn't personal?" Claire met his gaze. "I expect you to believe the evidence." Silence followed. Then the next question. Douglas shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something. He nodded without hearing it. When it was over, the room buzzed with competing narratives. Claire stood, gathered her papers, and turned. For a brief moment, her eyes met Douglas's. There was no triumph there, no pity, just recognition. He looked away first. Outside, the press surged. Claire moved through them with practiced calm, declining comment, offering nothing that could be twisted. That evening, back in her office, she found an envelope on her desk. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "You think this ends here?" She stared at it for a long moment, then handed it to security. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't." Across town, Douglas watched the hearing replay on mute. He saw himself in the background, smaller than he'd ever looked, a supporting character in a story he no longer controlled. For the first time, the possibility settled in his chest with real weight. This wasn't a setback. It was a reckoning. And it was only beginning. The subpoena arrived at dawn. Douglas Hale found it wedged beneath the door of his apartment, the white envelope stark against the dark wood floor, like a wound that refused to close. He stood over it for a long time, before bending down, as if proximity alone could make it detonate. When he finally picked it up, his hands were steady in a way that frightened him more than shaking would have. Federal grand jury, transportation interference, pattern of misconduct. Pattern. The word echoed. He dropped the envelope on the counter and poured the coffee he no longer tasted. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference. Delivery trucks, joggers, a woman walking her dog, oblivious to the fact that a man 3 floors above her was watching his life compress into legal language. Across town, Claire Monroe sat in traffic, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, eyes forward. The radio murmured about markets and weather. Nothing about her. Not yet. She preferred it that way. Her phone vibrated. Security update. Envelope received. Handwriting sample inconclusive. Threat level assessed as low, but non-zero. She exhaled slowly. Low but non-zero was the space she lived in now. At the office, she was met with a different kind of tension. Not hostility. Anticipation. People spoke more carefully around her, watched her reactions, measured themselves. Victor Langley intercepted her before she reached her desk. "The grand jury moves fast," he said. "Once they convene, there's no pulling it back." Claire nodded. "Good. They're asking for your testimony again." "I'll give it." He hesitated. Off the record, they're considering expanding beyond aviation. Corporate conduct, influence, political pressure. Claire stopped walking, turned to him. "Then Douglas Hale becomes a footnote." Victor studied her face. "You're comfortable with that?" "Yes." In a law firm conference room downtown, Douglas sat opposite 3 attorneys who spoke in alternating turns, each sentence narrowing the corridor ahead. "The civil suits are coming," one said. "Your board is meeting without you," another added. "A plea might limit exposure." Douglas stared at the table. "I didn't kill anyone." The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate. "No," the first lawyer said carefully. "You didn't." Douglas leaned back, pressing his fingers into his temples. "This escalated because of her." "Incorrect," the second lawyer said. "It escalated because you touched her." Douglas's jaw tightened. "You're on her side now." "We're on reality's side," the third replied. Later, alone again, Douglas wandered his apartment like a stranger. He paused at a framed photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself, smiling beside a governor at a fundraiser. He took it down, looked at it, set it face down on the table. The phone rang. Unknown number. He answered without thinking. "Hello?" A woman's voice. Calm, unfamiliar. "Mr. Hale, this is Marianne Price with the Chronicle." He closed his eyes. "I have no comment." "We're running a piece tomorrow," she said. "About your prior settlements." Douglas's chest tightened. "Those were resolved?" Quietly, Marianne replied, "We have 3 former flight attendants willing to speak on background." He felt something inside him finally give way. "This is a witch hunt?" "Maybe," she said, "but witches usually don't leave this much evidence." She hung up. Douglas sank into a chair, breath shallow. The walls felt closer now, the air thinner. He'd spent decades curating an image. It was unraveling in public, thread by thread. That afternoon, Claire sat with a group of junior investigators, walking them through the anatomy of escalation. Not the legal framework, the human one. "Power tests boundaries first," she said. "Small violations. See what sticks. Silence becomes permission." A young analyst raised her hand. "How do you stop it early?" Claire didn't answer immediately. "You don't wait for certainty," she said finally. "You act when something feels wrong. The system is built to respond late. People have to respond early." The room was quiet, absorbing. That evening, Claire attended a small gathering at a colleague's home. Nothing official, no speeches, just conversation. Wine poured carefully. Laughter held back, cautious but real. Someone asked her how she was holding up. She considered the question. "I'm tired," she said, "but clear." Another voice chimed in. "You scared a lot of people." Claire smiled faintly. "Good." Back at his apartment, Douglas packed a suitcase he wasn't sure he'd need. Habit. Instinct. He folded shirts with unnecessary precision. The act gave his hands something to do. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was his daughter. "Dad," she texted, "I can't talk right now. Please don't contact me until this is over." He stared at the message until the screen dimmed. The next morning, the Chronicle piece dropped. It was thorough, sourced, relentless. The headline didn't scream. It didn't need to. Patterns of Silence, the untold record of a corporate executive. Douglas watched the stock ticker scroll beneath the article. Another drop. Another message from the board. This one, shorter. Effective immediately. Your resignation is requested. He laughed once. A dry, broken sound. Across the city, Claire read the same article on her tablet between meetings. She didn't linger on Douglas's name. She focused on the language, the shift, the way accountability was being framed not as punishment, but as overdue correction. Her phone buzzed. Victor again. They want you to lead the task force, he said. Permanent. Claire closed her eyes briefly. The weight of it settled, heavy, but familiar. Okay, she said. That night, as the city dimmed and screens glowed in living rooms across the country, two people sat alone with very different kinds of silence. Douglas Hale sat in the dark, the suitcase still open at the foot of his bed, the future narrowed to court dates and headlines he couldn't outrun. Claire Monroe stood at her window, lights of the city spread beneath her, like a map of unfinished work. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was unfolding. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polish, a place where time moved differently, slower and heavier. Douglas Hale stood at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit the way it once had. Weight had slipped off him without permission. His shoulders curved inward now, as if the building itself pressed down. Across the aisle, the gallery filled with quiet purpose. Journalists, advocates. A few faces he recognized from former lives, all avoiding his eyes. No one waited, no one nodded. The distance between him and everyone else felt wider than the room. When Claire Monroe entered, the room shifted without a sound, not because she commanded attention deliberately, but because she didn't. She took her seat with the same controlled economy she'd shown on the plane. No flourish, no hesitation, just presence. Douglas watched her profile, the line of her jaw, the stillness of her hands. He searched for something human there. Fatigue, doubt, anger. He found none of it. The judge called the room to order. Voices fell away. Pens hovered. The day began. The prosecution didn't open with outrage. They opened with sequence. Time stamps, procedures. The mechanics of safety and violation laid out piece by piece until the pattern emerged, undeniable in its accumulation. Claire was called early. She walked to the stand, took the oath, sat. Her voice when she spoke was neither soft nor loud. It was calibrated, meant to be understood. She described the flight, the refusal, the escalation. She described the moment of impact without embellishment, naming it for what it was. Assault. She described the grip on her arm, the obstruction, the delay. Douglas listened, a tightness spreading through his chest. He wanted to interrupt, to explain, to reframe. But the courtroom did not belong to him anymore. The defense tried to redirect. They asked about her role, her authority, her presence on the flight. Were you acting in an official capacity at the time? Yes. Did you disclose that? No. Why not? Claire met the attorney's eyes. Because my safety should not depend on my title. A murmur rippled through the gallery before the judge silenced it. The attorney pressed. Isn't it true that had Mr. Hale known your position, his behavior might have been different? Claire paused. Not for effect. for accuracy. That is precisely the problem. The words hung there, unmovable. Douglas's lawyer shifted in his seat. The defense pivoted, but the room had already tilted. Outside the courthouse, the city moved on. Inside, time thickened. When Douglas was called, he stood slowly, each step a negotiation with gravity. He took the oath with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. He spoke of stress, of misunderstanding, of regret. He said he was sorry more than once, the word dulled by repetition. When asked why he touched her, he hesitated. Too long. I felt dismissed, he said finally. The silence that followed was not sympathetic. Claire watched him without expression. She felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only a quiet clarity, settling deeper into her bones. The judge listened, took notes, asked a question no one expected. Mr. Hale, he said, do you believe your frustration justified your actions? Douglas swallowed. No. The judge nodded once. Then we are done here. The verdict came later that afternoon. Guilty on all counts. The word landed with a dull finality. Not a thunderclap. A closing door. Douglas sat as the room reacted around him. The sentence would come later. More hearings, more process. But the core had been decided. As he was escorted out, cameras surged. He did not look up. Claire exited through a side door, away from the noise. The sky had cleared. The light was sharp, almost unforgiving. Her phone vibrated. Messages stacked one after another. Statements, requests, praise, condemnation. She silenced it. At home that evening, she cooked for herself. Simple, methodical. The act grounded her. She ate slowly, tasting each bite, letting the day settle. Across town, Douglas sat in a holding room again, this one larger, colder. He stared at the wall and thought about the word dismissed. How small it sounded now. How enormous the cost. The next weeks unfolded with an efficiency that surprised him. Sentencing, asset freezes, civil actions. The architecture of consequence built itself around him. Claire moved through her days with renewed purpose. The task force took shape under her direction. Policies drafted, trainings mandated, systems adjusted, not perfectly, but measurably. One evening, she received a letter forwarded from the detention center. No return address. She knew who it was from before opening it. The handwriting was careful, apologetic. Too late. She read it once, folded it, filed it away. Not out of cruelty, but because closure did not require response. Months later, she stood in an airport again. Different city. Different flight. The gate hummed with ordinary impatience. She watched families, business travelers, the choreography of movement and waiting. A flight attendant recognized her, hesitated, smiled. Welcome aboard. Claire returned the smile, sat down, buckled in. As the plane taxied, she looked out the window at the sprawl of lights and steel and possibility. The world was still imperfect. Power still tested boundaries. But sometimes resistance held. Somewhere, Douglas Hale counted days in a different kind of terminal, one without departures. The plane lifted. The ground fell away. Claire closed her eyes, not to escape, but to rest. The sentence was handed down on a grey morning that smelled like rain and disinfectant. Douglas Hale stood when the judge entered, though his knees protested. The courtroom felt smaller than it had weeks before, as if the walls had crept inward during the nights he'd spent rehearsing apologies no one had asked for. He kept his hands clasped in front of him, a posture he'd once associated with deference from others. Now it was the only way to keep them from shaking. The judge spoke without ornament. Months of incarceration. Fines calibrated to harm, not status. Mandatory counseling. A permanent record that would follow him long after the headlines lost interest. Douglas heard the words but felt them land elsewhere, like weather reported for a city he no longer lived in. When the gavel fell, there was no gasp, no drama. Just the quiet click of process continuing. He was led away through a side corridor, past a narrow window that showed a sliver of sky. He paused for half a second, just long enough to register the color. Then the door closed. Across the city, Claire Monroe watched the sentencing on a muted screen in her office. She didn't celebrate. She didn't flinch. She watched until the judge stood and the feed cut away, then turned back to the document on her desk. Implementation timelines, training modules, enforcement metrics, the work that followed consequence. A knock came at her door. Lisa Carter stood there, uniform crisp, posture straighter than Claire remembered. "They asked me to help consult on the training," Lisa said, a little disbelieving. "Crew response, escalation protocols." Claire smiled. "You should." Lisa exhaled, relief and pride tangling together. "I never thought. After all these years." "You earned it," Claire said. "Every year." Lisa nodded, eyes bright, then stepped back into the hallway, shoulders squared in a new way. The changes moved faster than Claire expected. Airlines revised policies. Unions demanded clarity. Passengers paid attention, at least for a while. The phrase "zero tolerance" appeared in more than one press release, and this time it was backed by teeth. Claire travelled often now. Meetings stacked back to back, cities blurred together. She learned to sleep on planes again, not from exhaustion, but from trust. Trust that she could close her eyes without surrendering ground. At one airport, a woman stopped her near the security line. Mid-30s, nervous smile. "I saw what you did," the woman said quietly. "On that flight." Claire waited. "I didn't move last week," the woman continued. "When a man told me to. I almost did. But I didn't." Claire felt the weight of that settle, heavier than any headline. How did it go? The woman smiled, small but real. He did. They parted without names exchanged. They didn't need them. Douglas's days were structured now by bells and counts. The facility was not violent, but it was relentless. Time pressed forward with bureaucratic patience. He learned the rhythms quickly, learned which corners were loud, which were quiet, learned how little his former life mattered inside these walls. He read more than he ever had. Policy manuals, case law, history he'd once dismissed as academic. Sometimes he read letters from people he'd hurt, forwarded through legal channels. Sometimes he didn't. One afternoon, he sat across from a counselor in a room painted an institutional beige that defied memory. "When did you first believe rules didn't apply to you?" she asked. Douglas laughed once, then stopped. The question wasn't rhetorical. "I don't know," he said finally. "Gradually." She nodded. "That's how it usually happens." He stared at the table. "I thought power meant not having to think about it. And now," he said, voice low, "it's all I think about." Claire stood before a room of lawmakers weeks later, testifying on outcomes rather than incident. The data spoke clearly. Reduced on-board incidents, faster crew intervention, clearer authority lines. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about prevention. Systems that rely on victims to absorb harm are broken systems." A senator leaned forward. "And if the attention fades?" Claire met his gaze. "Then the policies must outlast the attention." Afterward, in the corridor, a junior aide approached her. "You changed things," Claire shook her head. "I helped move them." That night, alone in her apartment, she found herself restless. She walked to the window, city lights smeared by rain, and thought about the moment on the plane when she'd chosen stillness over retreat. How small it had felt, how large it had become. Her phone buzzed with a message from Victor. "They're offering you the permanent chair, full authority." She didn't reply immediately. She made tea instead. Let the kettle boil, let the steam fog the air. When she finally typed back, it was a single word. "Yes." Months passed. The story receded into case studies and training videos. New outrages captured the public imagination. The cycle continued, as it always did. But the changes remained. On a quiet morning, Claire boarded another flight. Different airline, different crew. She took her seat and glanced around, noting the subtle differences. The posted policies, the crew briefing visible through the open cockpit door. A flight attendant caught her eye and smiled. "Welcome aboard." Claire smiled back. "Thank you." As the plane lifted, she felt the familiar pressure, the momentary surrender to gravity, then the release. She watched the city shrink beneath the clouds, thinking not of Douglas Hale, but of the woman at security, of Lisa, of the countless moments that would never make the news because they didn't need to. Somewhere else, Douglas counted another day. The world moved without him now. That realization no longer burned. It simply existed. Claire closed her eyes, not to forget, but to carry forward. The work was ongoing. The skimina endless. The prison yard was quiet in the early hours, the kind of quiet that pressed in rather than soothed. Douglas Hale walked the perimeter slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the chain-link fence crowned with dull coils of wire. The routine had become automatic. Wake, count, walk, eat, sleep. Time no longer rushed or dragged. It simply accumulated. He had stopped checking the calendar. Dates had lost their meaning once ambition no longer pulled him forward. Inside these walls, the future was measured in routines, not plans. The men around him talked about appeals, about luck, about how the world had done them wrong. Douglas listened and said little. Somewhere along the way, silence had become the most honest thing he had left. He thought often about the plane, not the courtroom, not the cameras. The plane, the narrow aisle, the smell of coffee. The moment he had assumed the world would step aside because it always had. That was where everything truly ended, even if it took months for the rest to catch up. Across the country, Claire Monroe stood on a stage in a city that never slept, lights warm against polished wood. The audience was full but attentive, the kind of crowd that leaned forward instead of back. She didn't speak about Douglas. She never did anymore. She spoke about systems, about patterns, about the quiet moments where choices were made long before headlines existed. Power, she said calmly, is not volume. It's responsibility, sustained over time. The applause that followed was measured, respectful, not thunderous, not performative. It didn't need to be. She stepped off the stage without lingering, shaking hands, exchanging brief words that mattered more than praise. Later that night, alone in her hotel room, Claire sat by the window and looked out over the grid of lights below. She thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. How resistance was rarely dramatic in the moment, but almost always expensive afterward. She felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from alignment rather than struggle. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lisa Carter. First full training rollout completed today. Crew confidence is up. Incidents down. Claire smiled softly and set the phone aside. Back inside the facility, Douglas sat at a metal table with a paperback open in front of him. He read slowly now, carefully. Words carried weight again. He had learned that attention was not something you took. It was something you earned, and something you could lose permanently. A younger inmate sat across from him, restless. "You were really somebody out there," the man said. Douglas closed the book. "I thought I was." The man frowned. "What happened?" Douglas considered the question. Not defensively. Honestly. I stopped listening. The man didn't know what to do with that. He shrugged and stood, leaving Douglas alone with the echo of his own words. Months later, a policy manual bearing Claire's name circulated across agencies and airlines. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't go viral. But it changed procedures, expectations, accountability. The kind of change that didn't ask for permission once it was written into practice. Claire read the final approval notice on a quiet morning, sunlight cutting across her desk. She didn't celebrate. She closed the file and opened the next one. There was always a next one. On another flight, another day, she sat in a familiar seat as passengers boarded around her. A man hesitated in the aisle, uncertain, then stepped aside for someone else without being asked. A small thing, almost invisible, almost everything. The plane taxied, lifted. The ground fell away again. Somewhere far below, Douglas Hale looked up through a narrow window at a slice of sky and felt something close to understanding settle in his chest. Not forgiveness, not redemption, just clarity. The world had not ended for him. It had continued without him at the center of it. That was the lesson he would carry longer than his sentence. High above, Claire rested her head back and closed her eyes, the steady hum of the engines wrapping around her like proof that systems, when corrected, could carry people forward instead of grinding them down. Stories like this don't end with applause or silence. They end with consequences that ripple outward, shaping choices that never make the news, protecting people who will never know why the moment felt different, safer, fairer. If this story resonated, support the work by hitting like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment with 3 words.